The winter of 1943 arrived early in the Norwegian mountains, bringing with it a cold that seemed to pierce through even the thickest wool. In the small village of Rjukan, nestled deep in the Telemark region, life had become a careful balance between survival and resistance. Every morning brought the same gray sky, the same bitter wind, and the same careful silence that had settled over the valley since the German occupation began. The village itself had changed dramatically since the Germans arrived in the spring of 1940. The cobblestone streets that once rang with the laughter of children now echoed with the harsh sounds of military boots and barked commands in a foreign language. The old church bell, which had marked the hours for 300 years, had been silenced by order of the occupation authorities. They said it was for security reasons, but everyone knew the real reason. They wanted to erase the Norwegian spirit, to make the people forget who they were. 15-year-old Erik Haugen had known these mountains his entire life. His family had herded sheep in these valleys for generations, and even the war couldn't change the rhythm of their work. The animals still needed tending, still needed to be moved between pastures, regardless of which flag flew over the village below. But everything else had changed in ways both large and small. Erik could still remember the day the Germans came. He'd been 13 then, standing beside his father and brother on the main road, watching the convoy of trucks and motorcycles roll into their quiet village. His mother had gripped his shoulder so tightly it hurt, her fingernails digging through his shirt. She hadn't said a word, but Erik had felt her whole body trembling. That first week, the soldiers had been almost friendly, handing out chocolate to the children, smiling at the young women, making a show of paying for goods they took from the shops. But the facade had crumbled quickly. Within a month, there were curfews, restrictions on movement, mandatory reports to the occupation headquarters. Within 6 months, people began disappearing. The schoolteacher, Mr. Olsen, who'd been heard making disparaging remarks about Hitler. The Johansen family, who were rumored to have hidden British agents passing through. Old Mrs. Berg, whose only crime had been refusing to serve German officers in her cafe. The disappearances were never explained. One day, someone would be there. The next day, their house would be empty, their possessions gone, and no one would speak their name again. Fear had become as much a part of daily life as breathing. If you're interested in more stories of courage from history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue bringing you these incredible true tales. On the morning of December 8th, Erik woke before dawn as always. His family's farmhouse was small, just 4 rooms heated by a single stone fireplace that his great-grandfather had built with his own hands. The walls were thick timber, chinked with moss and mud, and decorated with the carved rose-mailing patterns that his grandmother had painted in brighter days. Now, those cheerful reds and blues seemed faded, like everything else in their world. His father, Johan, was already awake, stirring the fire in their small farmhouse kitchen. The orange glow cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor, and Erik could see his breath forming small clouds in the cold air inside their home. His father moved with the efficiency of a man who'd performed the same tasks 1,000 times, adding just enough wood to bring warmth without wasting their dwindling supply. Johan Haugen had aged 10 years in the 3 since the occupation began. His hair, once dark like Erik's, had gone almost entirely gray. Deep lines had appeared around his eyes and mouth, carved there by worry and grief. He rarely smiled anymore, and when he did, it never quite reached his eyes. The disappearance of Erik's brother Bjorn had done that to him, had stolen something fundamental from the man who'd once taught his sons to laugh at hardship and find joy in simple things. His father looked up from the fire, his weathered face serious in the flickering light. "You'll take the north pasture today. Keep the flock close to the tree line." And Erik, his father paused, his voice dropping lower. "If you see anything unusual, you come straight back. No heroics. You understand?" Erik nodded, though a part of him bristled at being treated like a child. He'd been working these mountains alone for 2 years now, since his older brother Bjorn had disappeared. They didn't speak about Bjorn anymore, but everyone knew he'd joined the resistance. Every family in Rjukan had someone involved in the underground movement, someone fighting back in whatever small ways they could. The last time Erik had seen his brother was a night in January, nearly 2 years ago. Bjorn had been 19, tall and strong, with the same dark hair and blue eyes that ran in the Haugen family. He'd come to Erik's room after midnight, waking him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Erik had opened his eyes to find his brother fully dressed, a pack on his back, an expression on his face that Erik had never seen before. Determination mixed with fear, sadness mixed with fierce pride. "I have to go," Bjorn had whispered. "There's work to be done in the mountains. Important work." Erik had wanted to ask 100 questions, but Bjorn had placed a finger to his lips. "The less you know, the safer you'll be." "But Erik, listen to me." He'd gripped Erik's shoulder hard. "You're the man of the family now, while I'm gone. Take care of mother and father. Be smart. Be careful. But if the time comes when you have to choose between safety and doing what's right, don't hesitate. promise me." Eric had promised, not really understanding what he was promising. Bjorn had hugged him then, fierce and quick, and then he was gone, slipping out the window into the winter darkness. Eric had watched from that window until his brother's figure disappeared into the tree line, and that was the last time he'd seen Bjorn Haugen. For months afterward, Eric's mother had set a place for Bjorn at every meal. She would cook his favorite foods and leave them on the table, as if her absent son might walk through the door at any moment. Eventually, Johan had gently asked her to stop, and Ingrid had put away Bjorn's plate with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face. But she still made his favorite rye bread every Sunday, still left the lamp burning in the window every night, just in case. Eric pulled himself from these memories and focused on preparing for the day ahead. His mother was still asleep, exhausted from spending most of the previous night mending clothing by candlelight. The Germans had rationed everything, including lamp oil, so the family saved it for emergencies. Most evening work was done by firelight or candlelight now, straining the eyes and making simple tasks take twice as long. The sky was still dark when Eric set out, his dog Finn trotting faithfully beside him. Finn was a Norwegian elk hound, gray and sturdy, with the intelligence and loyalty that made the breed invaluable to mountain families. Eric's grandfather had given him Finn as a puppy 3 years ago, just months before the old man passed away. "Train him well," his grandfather had said, his gnarled hands stroking the puppy's soft fur. "A good dog is worth 3 men in these mountains." He'd been right. Finn had an uncanny ability to sense danger, to read the mountains in ways that even experienced shepherds couldn't match. The sheep moved slowly through the snow, their breath creating a low fog around the herd. There were only 23 of them now, down from the 40 they'd had before the war. The Germans had requisitioned livestock throughout the region, taking the best animals and leaving families with barely enough to survive. Eric's father had hidden these sheep in high mountain pastures during the last requisition, claiming they'd been lost in a storm. It was a dangerous lie, but the alternative was starvation. Eric pulled his father's old coat tighter around himself. It was too big for him, the sleeves hanging past his hands, but it was warm, and that was all that mattered. The coat smelled like his father, like pipe tobacco and wood smoke and sheep, a comforting scent in the darkness. Underneath, Eric wore 2 sweaters his mother had knitted from wool they'd saved, and beneath those, a shirt that had once belonged to Bjorn. Wearing his brother's clothes made Eric feel closer to him somehow, as if Bjorn's courage and strength might transfer through the fabric. The walk to the north pasture took nearly 2 hours through the deepening snow. Eric knew every rock, every tree, every turn of the path, even in darkness. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of Haugen shepherds. His father had taught him, as his grandfather had taught his father, as his great-grandfather had taught before that. These mountains were in Eric's blood, part of his identity as much as his name. As he walked, Eric's mind wandered to the changes the war had brought to these familiar paths. There were places he could no longer go, areas the Germans had declared off-limits. The heavy water plant at Vemork, just a few kilometers away, had been heavily fortified. German soldiers patrolled the roads constantly. Eric had heard whispers that the plant was producing something important for the German war effort, something the resistance desperately wanted to stop. He didn't know the details. Like his father always said, knowing too much could get you killed. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale blue, the snow started falling again. At first, it was gentle, almost peaceful, the kind of snow that made the world seem clean and new. The flakes were large and soft, landing on Eric's eyelashes and melting on his cheeks. Finn playfully snapped at them, momentarily forgetting his working dog dignity to act like a puppy again. Despite everything, despite the occupation and the fear and the hunger that was slowly becoming their normal, Eric felt a moment of simple peace. But within an hour, that gentle snowfall had transformed into a full blizzard. The wind came howling down from the peaks, gathering strength as it funneled through the valleys. What had been soft flakes became hard pellets of ice that stung Eric's exposed skin. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Eric could feel the cold penetrating through all his layers, settling into his bones. The wind howled through the valley, driving the snow horizontally across the mountainside. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Eric could barely see Finn, who was just a few meters ahead, let alone the sheep scattered around him. This was dangerous weather, the kind that killed unprepared travelers every winter. Eric had heard stories his whole life about shepherds and hunters who'd been caught in storms like this, found frozen weeks later when the snow melted. Eric struggled to keep the flock together, calling commands to Finn, who worked tirelessly to prevent the sheep from scattering. The dog was in his element, moving with purpose and precision, somehow able to track the sheep even when Eric couldn't see them. "Stay close, Finn!" Eric shouted over the wind. "Keep them tight." The familiar landscape disappeared behind a white curtain, and even Eric, who could navigate these mountains blindfolded, began to feel disoriented. The landmarks he relied on were invisible. The path he'd walked 1,000 times had vanished beneath the snow. For the first time in his life, Eric felt truly lost in mountains he'd known since childhood. Fear began to creep in, cold and insidious like the wind itself. He was trying to guide the flock toward a cluster of pines that would provide shelter when Finn suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The dog's whole body had gone rigid, his hackles raised, his lips pulled back to show teeth. Eric had seen Finn face down wolves and bears with less intensity. This was different. This was the response to human danger. Eric froze, every sense alert. In occupied Norway, an unexpected sound could mean danger. It could mean German patrols, or it could mean resistance fighters, and either option could be deadly if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. His heart began to pound, the sound of it loud in his ears even over the howling wind. Through the driving snow, Eric heard it. Voices, men speaking in German. The guttural sounds of the language that had become synonymous with fear and oppression. Eric had learned to recognize German even when he couldn't make out the words, had learned to tense up at the very sound of it. His heart began to pound even harder. German patrols occasionally passed through these mountains, but never this far north, never this high up. The main roads were kilometers away. There was nothing up here but rock and ice and the few hardy sheep that could survive these conditions. Why would Germans be here? Eric dropped to a crouch behind a large boulder, pulling Finn close and commanding him to be silent. The dog obeyed instantly, though his body remained tense, ready to fight or flee at Eric's command. The sheep, sensing something wrong, had already begun to cluster together near the trees, their survival instincts stronger than their panic. Eric crept forward, moving from rock to rock, using the techniques his brother had taught him years ago when they played games in these same mountains. Games that Bjorn had insisted were more than games, training for something Eric hadn't understood until the Germans came. Stay low, Bjorn had said. Use the terrain. Move when the wind is loudest, when sound is covered. Watch where you put your feet. A single snapped branch can give you away. Eric moved like a ghost, each step carefully placed, each movement calculated. The snow helped, muffling sound, but it also made footing treacherous. One slip, one sound, and he would be discovered. His mouth was dry despite the snow melting on his face. His hands shook, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. What he saw made his blood run cold, made his breath catch in his throat, made every instinct scream at him to run. Below him, sheltered in a narrow ravine he'd explored 100 times as a child, were German soldiers. Not a small patrol, dozens of them, maybe more. The ravine was perhaps 200 meters long and 30 meters wide at its broadest point, a natural shelter carved by ancient waters that no longer flowed here. Eric and Bjorn had played there as children, pretending it was a Viking ship or a fortress or whatever their imaginations conjured that day. Now it housed something far more sinister. Through the swirling snow, Eric could make out tents, at least 20 of them arranged in military precision. There was equipment everywhere, crates and boxes stacked and covered with tarps, what looked like radio gear, the antennas barely visible against the white background, field kitchens with smoke rising from chimneys, ammunition boxes, weapons racks. This wasn't a patrol. This was an encampment, a staging area. This was an army preparing for something. Eric's mind raced as he tried to count the soldiers he could see. 30, 40, 50. But those were just the ones visible in the small area he could observe through the snow. The tents alone suggested many more. If each tent held 10 men and there were 20 tents, that was 200 soldiers. 200 German troops hidden in a ravine that wasn't on any military map, that only locals knew existed. The ravine wasn't visible from the main road or from the village. You could stand on the ridge just 50 meters away and never know it was there. The Germans had chosen their position with military precision. They'd found one of the few places in these mountains where a large force could hide undetected. Someone had scouted this location carefully, someone who knew the terrain. Eric watched as soldiers moved between tents, going about their duties with military efficiency. He saw officers consulting maps, pointing toward the valley below. He saw communication equipment being tested, radios crackling with static and garbled voices. He saw weapons being cleaned and maintained. He saw a discipline and organization that suggested this wasn't a temporary camp. They'd been here for days at least, possibly weeks. And then Eric saw something that made his stomach drop. On one of the larger tents, he could make out insignia even through the snow, the double lightning bolts of the SS. These weren't regular Wehrmacht troops. These were elite soldiers, the most dangerous and fanatical of Hitler's forces. Eric felt sick. What were SS troops doing here? What were they planning? His mind flashed to the heavy water plant at Vemork. Was this about that? Were they planning to increase security? Or was this about the resistance? Had the Germans learned about resistance operations in the area? Were they planning a sweep, mass arrests, executions? He thought of his father's warning. Come straight back. No heroics. But he also thought of Bjorn, of the night his brother had left, the fierce determination in his eyes when he'd said that someone had to fight back, that someone had to stand up. If Bjorn was still alive, if he was still fighting in these mountains, these troops would be hunting him. 200 SS soldiers could do devastating damage to the resistance network. Eric began to back away slowly, keeping low, moving with infinite care. Every muscle in his body was tense, every nerve screaming. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the freezing temperature. His breathing was shallow, controlled, though his lungs wanted to gasp for air. Each movement took an eternity. Lift the foot, test the ground, shift the weight, repeat. One wrong move, one sound, and 200 SS soldiers would know he'd found them. Finn moved with him, the dog's training taking over. They'd practiced this before, not knowing they'd ever need it for real. Eric would hide, and Finn would find him. They'd move through the forest in silence, pretending to stalk imaginary prey. Now those games had become deadly serious. He was almost back to the boulder, almost to relative safety when disaster struck. His foot came down on what he thought was solid ground. Instead, it was a patch of ice hidden beneath the fresh snow. His ankle turned, his balance shifted, and Eric fell. He tried to catch himself, tried to make the fall silent, but his knee hit a rock concealed under the snow. The sound was small, a dull thud barely audible over the wind. But in that moment, to Eric, it sounded like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The world seemed to freeze. Eric lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, praying that the wind and snow had covered the sound, that the Germans below were too busy with their work to notice. Then came the shout that shattered that hope. "Halt!" a German voice shouted, sharp and commanding. "There's someone up there, on the ridge." Eric didn't wait. He couldn't afford to. He scrambled to his feet and ran, ignoring the pain in his ankle, ignoring everything except the desperate need to escape. Finn was beside him instantly, matching his pace, the dog's presence somehow comforting even in the midst of terror. His lungs burned as he pushed through the deep snow. Each step was a battle against the accumulation that came past his knees in places. The cold air seared his throat with each gasping breath. Behind him, he heard shouts, orders being barked in German, the sounds of men scrambling up the slope, the sounds of pursuit. Then came the first shot, the crack of a rifle, sharp even through the storm. Eric didn't know where the bullet went, didn't dare look back. He just ran, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. A second shot followed, then a third. He heard one whine past his ear, close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Another cracked against a rock to his left, sending stone chips flying. They were shooting at a child, at a 15-year-old boy whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The realization filled Eric with a terror deeper than anything he'd ever known. These weren't men who would show mercy. These were SS troops who killed without hesitation, without remorse. The sheep scattered as Eric crashed through them, their panic adding to the chaos. They bleated and ran in all directions, their hooves churning the snow into a chaotic mess that might, Eric hoped desperately, confuse his pursuers. He heard Finn bark, not at the sheep, but at the men behind them, the dog's protective instincts warring with his training to stay with Eric. "Come, Finn," Eric gasped. "Come on, boy." Another bullet thudded into a tree trunk ahead of him, showering him with bark and splinters. Eric threw himself to the side, changing direction, zigzagging as he ran. He'd seen rabbits do this when being chased by foxes, making themselves harder targets. It might work for him, too. The forest swallowed him, the dense pines providing cover from both the bullets and the watching eyes below. The shooting stopped, either because the Germans couldn't see him anymore or because they didn't want to waste ammunition. But Eric could still hear them behind him, crashing through the underbrush, shouting to each other, coordinating their pursuit. Eric ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, following paths only he knew, taking shortcuts through the underbrush that would be impossible for grown men in heavy uniforms and military boots to follow. He went places he knew were treacherous, where the snow concealed holes and sudden drops, places he could navigate by instinct, but where his pursuers would have to slow down, be cautious. He squeezed through a gap between two boulders that would be impossibly tight for a full-grown soldier with gear. He scrambled up a scree slope that shifted under his feet, but that he knew would shift even more for heavier men. He followed a deer trail that wound through brush so thick it tore at his clothes and skin, but that would be impassable in heavy winter uniforms. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded. Either they'd given up, or they'd lost his trail, or they simply couldn't follow where he'd gone. But Eric didn't stop, couldn't stop. Terror drove him forward long after his legs wanted to give out, long after his lungs screamed for rest. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in the snow behind a fallen log, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and fear. Finn pressed against him, panting heavily, the dog's warm body a comfort against Eric's trembling. For several minutes, Eric just lay there, unable to move, unable to think, his mind blank with shock and fear. Slowly, his thinking returned. He strained to hear sounds of pursuit, but there was only the wind and the pounding of his own heart gradually slowing. Either they'd given up, or they hadn't been able to follow his trail through the storm. The blizzard that had put him in danger had also saved him, covering his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. But they'd seen him. They knew someone had found them. What would they do now? For several minutes, Eric lay there trying to catch his breath, trying to think through the fog of fear and exhaustion. His whole body ached. His ankle throbbed where he'd twisted it. His lungs felt like they were on fire from breathing the frozen air so hard. His hands were numb, his feet were numb, and he realized he'd lost his hat somewhere during the chase. The cold was seeping into him, dangerous cold that could kill as surely as German bullets. But more than the physical pain, more than the cold, Eric felt the weight of the decision he now had to make. The Germans now knew someone had seen them. They would either move their position or increase their guard, maybe both. But they couldn't know who had seen them, couldn't know if it was a shepherd boy who might tell someone or just a hunter who would keep the knowledge to himself out of fear. Eric had that advantage, at least. The question was, what would he do with it? If he told his father would have to decide what to do with the information. And in occupied Norway, that decision could get their entire family killed. The Germans had made examples of whole households suspected of aiding the resistance. Eric had seen it himself, had walked past the burned-out shell of the Hansen farm where an entire family had been executed, their bodies left in the yard as a warning. The youngest child had been only 8 years old. But if he didn't tell someone, whatever those soldiers were planning would go forward unopposed. 200 SS troops, elite soldiers. They weren't here on a training exercise. They were here for a purpose, and that purpose would undoubtedly involve Norwegian blood. How many resistance fighters would die? How many civilians would be rounded up? How many families would lose sons and fathers and brothers? Eric thought of Bjorn again, of the choice his brother had made. Some things were more important than safety, Bjorn had said. Some things were worth the risk. Eric had thought he understood, but now, lying in the snow with German voices still echoing in his memory, he realized he hadn't truly understood at all. It was easy to talk about courage when you weren't the one making the choice. It was easy to admire resistance fighters when you weren't the one putting your family at risk. But now he was. Now the choice was his, and it terrified him more than the bullets had. The journey home took twice as long as usual. Eric moved carefully, constantly watching for German patrols that might have been sent to find him. Every shadow made him jump. Every sound made his heart race. The snow continued to fall, which was both a blessing and a curse. It covered his tracks, making him harder to follow, but it also made the journey treacherous and exhausting. His twisted ankle made every step painful. Within an hour, it had swollen so badly that his boot felt too tight. By the second hour, he was limping noticeably, leaning on a walking stick he'd cut from a pine branch. Finn stayed close, seeming to sense that Eric needed support, occasionally pressing against Eric's leg as if trying to help him balance. The sheep were gone, scattered across the mountain by his panicked flight and the shooting. It would take days to round them up again, if they could be found at all. His father would be angry about that, though Eric suspected the anger would be more about fear for Eric's safety than about the lost animals. Still, those sheep represented food for the winter, wool for clothing. Their loss would be felt by the whole family. As Eric descended toward the valley where their farm lay, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Smoke. Not the usual chimney smoke from the farmhouses, but thick, black smoke rising from somewhere near the village. Had the Germans already struck? Had someone else seen the camp and reported it? Was his family safe? He pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain in his ankle, the exhaustion in his limbs. He had to know, had to get home, had to make sure his mother and father were alive. By the time Eric stumbled through the door of their farmhouse, it was late afternoon, and he was nearly frozen through. The warmth of the interior hit him like a physical force, making his frozen skin burn and tingle. His mother, Ingrid, cried out when she saw him, rushing to pull off his ice-encrusted coat and wrap him in blankets by the fire. "Where have you been? What happened?" His mother's hands shook as she worked, her face pale with fear and relief warring for dominance. "You're frozen solid. Your ankle. Eric, what happened?" "I'm okay," he managed through chattering teeth. "The smoke. What's burning?" "The Johansen barn," his mother said, her voice tight. The Germans claimed they found resistance materials hidden there. They arrested Lars Johansen and his oldest son. Then they burned the barn. With the winter hay still inside, the family will starve before spring. Eric felt sick. Lars Johansen was his father's friend, a quiet man who raised dairy cows and minded his own business. His son Per was only 17. Whether they'd actually hidden resistance materials or whether the Germans had planted evidence didn't matter. The outcome was the same. 2 more lives destroyed, 1 more family broken. His father took one look at Eric's face and sent his mother to the kitchen to prepare hot soup and tea. Then he sat down across from his son and waited, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp and knowing. Eric told him everything. The ravine, the soldiers, the tents and equipment, the SS insignia, his estimate of their numbers, the shooting, the chase through the forest. As he spoke, his father's expression grew darker, more troubled. When Eric finished, Johann sat in silence for a long moment, staring into the fire, his jaw working as if he were chewing on something bitter. When Eric finished, Johann sat in silence for a long moment, staring into the fire. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy. "You did well to come back. And you're right, this information needs to reach the right people. But, Eric," he looked at his son, and in that look was a mixture of pride and terrible sadness. "Once we share this information, everything changes. For all of us. Do you understand?" Eric nodded. He understood. In that moment, he wasn't a boy anymore. That night, after his mother had gone to bed, Eric's father left the house. He didn't say where he was going, but Eric knew. There was a network, whispered about, but never openly discussed. Messages passed from farmer to merchant to fisherman, eventually reaching the resistance fighters in the mountains or the British intelligence agents who sometimes operated in the region. 3 days passed. Eric didn't return to the mountains, staying close to the farm and helping his mother with work around the house. His father was distant, preoccupied, and twice Eric saw him burn papers in the fireplace after reading them. On the 4th day, strangers arrived at their farm. 2 men dressed as laborers, but moving with a purpose that suggested military training. They spent an hour with Eric in the barn, making him repeat his story, draw maps of what he'd seen, estimate numbers and equipment again and again. The men left as quietly as they'd arrived. Eric's father wouldn't meet his eyes that evening. 6 more days passed. Then, on a cold morning when the sky was clear for the first time in weeks, Eric heard it, a distant rumble that grew steadily louder. He ran outside and looked up to see them, a formation of British bombers, flying low through the mountain valleys. The sound was tremendous, shaking the ground beneath his feet. His mother came out and stood beside him, her hand gripping his shoulder tightly. They watched as the planes disappeared over the ridge, heading north, heading toward that hidden ravine. Even from this distance, they heard the explosions. Felt them, really. A series of deep booms that echoed through the valley, sending flocks of birds bursting from the trees. His father came out last, standing on the other side of Eric. Together, the 3 of them stood in the snow and watched the smoke begin to rise in the distance. That evening, the radio that his father kept hidden beneath the floorboards crackled to life with a BBC broadcast. The announcer spoke in Norwegian about a successful British air raid on a German military installation in the Telemark region. Intelligence reports, he said, had indicated a force of approximately 200 German troops preparing for operations against Norwegian resistance fighters. The raid had been completely successful. Eric's father turned off the radio and looked at his son. Johann's eyes were wet, though whether from pride or grief or fear, Eric couldn't tell. Probably all 3. "You saved lives today," his father said quietly. "Norwegian lives. Resistance fighters who would have been ambushed. Maybe even your brother if he's still out there. You did what needed to be done." But Eric noticed his father didn't say it was over, because it wasn't. The next morning, there would be German soldiers in the village, investigating, asking questions. The occupation would continue, the war would continue, and their family would continue to live with the knowledge of what they'd done, and the constant fear that someone might discover it. 2 weeks later, a German officer came to their farm. He was polite, formal, asking routine questions about livestock and supplies, but his eyes were sharp, and they lingered on Eric for a long moment. After he left, Eric's mother couldn't stop her hands from shaking as she prepared dinner. His father sat at the table, his jaw clenched, waiting for the sound of returning boots, the knock on the door that would change everything. But the knock never came. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, life resumed its careful rhythm. Eric returned to herding sheep in the mountains, though never again to the north pasture, never again to that ravine. The sheep had scattered during the raid, and most were lost, but a few had survived, and with them, Eric rebuilt the flock. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted, revealing the green valleys beneath. The war continued, but something had shifted in Eric. He no longer felt like a boy watching history happen around him. He had acted. He had chosen. And though the fear never completely left him, neither did the quiet pride in knowing that when the moment came, he had done the right thing. Years later, long after the war ended, after Norway was free again, Eric would sometimes take his own children up into those mountains. He would point out the ravine, now just another feature of the landscape, and he would tell them the story, not to glorify war or violence, but to teach them something important. He would tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite the fear. It's a 15-year-old boy in a snowstorm making a choice that could cost everything, because some things matter more than safety. It's ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances doing what needs to be done. And every time he told the story, he would end it the same way. He would remind his children that history isn't just made by generals and politicians, it's made by people like his father, who sent that message into the darkness, not knowing if it would make a difference. It's made by the members of the resistance who risked everything to fight back. It's made by the British pilots who flew through dangerous mountain valleys to hit a target based on the observations of a single shepherd boy. History, he would tell them, is made by all of us. Every choice matters. Every act of courage, no matter how small it might seem, ripples outward in ways we can never fully predict. Eric Haugen lived a long life after the war. He remained in Rjukan, raising his family in those same mountains, tending sheep just as his ancestors had done. His brother Bjorn never returned, and Eric never learned his fate. But he chose to believe that somewhere, in some battle or ambush, Bjorn's life had been saved by that air raid, by the destruction of those 200 German troops who would have hunted him. It was a small comfort, but in a war that took so much from so many, small comforts were often all you had. The ravine itself became something of a local landmark after the war. The scars from the bombing were visible for years, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Eventually, the Norwegian government placed a small memorial there, honoring the resistance fighters who had operated in the region and the Allied forces who had supported them. Eric attended the dedication ceremony. He stood at the back of the crowd listening to speeches about courage and sacrifice. No one mentioned his name. The officials didn't know the full story of how that raid came to be. The records were incomplete, the chain of communication lost to time in the chaos of war. And that was fine with Eric. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because it was right, because in that moment on the mountainside, hiding behind a boulder while bullets cracked through the air around him, he'd understood something fundamental about the world. Evil thrives when good people stay silent. Tyranny succeeds when ordinary citizens decide that safety is more important than justice. And freedom is preserved not by heroes and stories, but by regular people who, when faced with a choice between the easy path and the right path, choose the latter. That snowstorm in December of 1943 changed the course of Eric Haugen's life. It transformed him from a boy into a man, from a passive observer into an active participant in history. And though he lived with the fear and the weight of that choice for the rest of his days, he never regretted it. Because some things are worth the risk, some things are worth the fear, and sometimes in the bitter cold of a Norwegian winter, a single shepherd boy with a faithful dog at his side can change the fate of 200 soldiers and alter the course of a war, one small decision at a time.